You're watching the Everything Network.
After Vito Genovese's incarceration in 1959, a period of incomparable ineptitude befell his family's organization. The ruling hierarchy of Jerry Catena, the underboss, and the captains, Tommy Eboli and Mike Miranda, seemed totally incapable of asserting themselves into any form of strong leadership. Worse, direction that had been coming from Charlie Luciano's exile in Sicily to the ruling body after Genovese's imprisonment seemed to bear no fruit, although his advice and counsel over the transatlantic telephone lines did help to keep the family organization together. Then came the day in 1962 when word was flashed to the States that Lucky Luciano had died in Naples of a heart attack. With Genovese in prison and Luciano dead, the family headed for bad times. Men who took over the top slots couldn't rule with the kind of force Vito and Lucky had exercised. Those left to command, Jerry Catena, Tommy Eboli, and Mike Miranda, lacked either the stature or power to lead others. Only one mafioso among all others was deemed to have the qualities for leadership not only of his own family, but as the nation's godfather, the overseer of the national syndicate, Thomas Three-Finger Brown Lucchese. Lucchese had all the qualifications to be a ruling mafia chieftain from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He had run his own family over the years with total efficiency and effectiveness. His was a model after which other crime families patterned themselves. But Tommy Lucchese was in his 60s and had neither the desire nor stamina to undertake such a role. He was content to manage his own family and rake in the take from the mob's illicit and legitimate businesses. Lucchese, who had always rated high in the councils of the syndicate, might have recommended his own son-in-law's father, Carlo Gambino, to be the godfather. But Gambino wasn't ready for that role. He had just recently assumed the leadership of his own family after arranging Albert Anastasia's barbershop exit and had a lot of housekeeping chores ahead of him. There were two other family heads who had enough clout to merit consideration for the top job, but both Joe Profaci and Joe Bonanno were encountering increasing difficulties managing their own families. Profaci, whose organization of some 230 men was the smallest of the five families, was beginning to have big headaches in keeping his soldiers contented. That was because of Joe's hard-nosed, old-world ways that made him, in the eyes of his underworld army, a tyrant. Long after the other family bosses had ceased the practice of collecting tribute from their underlings, Profaci continued to demand $25 a month from all his subordinates. Ostensibly, these monies were held in escrow to pay members legal fees when they were jammed by the law or to ease the anguish of a soldier's family were he to meet an unfortunate accident. Another of the policies Profaci brought with him from Sicily was the imposition of a payoff from his soldiers, based upon a substantial percentage of their income from the operation of their own rackets. While all such mob-run businesses were protected by the family, other bosses made no such demands on their men. But they received voluntary tribute from their soldiers, which was given to them out of respect. What grated most against his men was that Profaci affected a lifestyle contrary to the modest ways other bosses carried on. Joe was making money hand over fist. He was one of the nation's leading distributors of olive oil and tomato paste. He was a millionaire many times over and lived in a showcase mansion on Long Island and a 300-acre estate in New Jersey that included a hunting lodge. Profaci might have offered his services to run the syndicate had it not been for the beginnings of rebellion in his family's ranks, spurred by the three Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert, and Joey, who by now, along with Joe Jelly Gioeli, were openly claiming they had fulfilled the contract on Anastasia. The Gallo brothers had grown up in Brooklyn's Bath Beach section, and from their adolescent years were constantly in trouble. Joey was the meanest and toughest of the brothers. He grew up wanting to be like movie gangster George Raft. He would stand on street corners, flipping a $50 and talk without moving his lips. He also affected the black shirt and white tie of Richard Widmark in the film Kiss of Death. Joey earned his nickname, Crazy Joe, when he was 21 after being arrested for a heist. He was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and was given a walk after agreeing to receive psychiatric counseling. But no one in the mob ever mentioned his nickname in his presence. They were too frightened of Joey. The Gallos first came into the spotlight in 1957 when they were summoned before the McClellan Select Committee on Improper Activities in the labor management field to tell about their jukebox rental racket. Not only did they supply the record coin machines for hefty monthly fees, but also organized a union of repairmen, Teamsters Local 266. What was illegal about it was that the Gallos and their enforcers compelled restaurants, taverns, and other renters of their jukeboxes to use their repairmen exclusively or be picketed. The committee learned nothing from the Gallos. They took the Fifth Amendment. However, Crazy Joe didn't leave Washington without uttering the memorable line after balking at questioning in the office of the committee's chief counsel, Robert F. Kennedy. "Nice carpet you got here, kid. Be good for a crap game." It was in early 1960 that the Gallos and two other soldiers, Joe Jelly Gioeli and Carmine the Snake Persico, joined forces to stage a revolt against Joe Profaci's oppressive rule. This decision followed a rather significant assignment they carried out for the boss: bump off a short, fat-faced policy banker, Frankie Schatz Abatamarco, who was holding back some of the take for himself. Although the Gallos, along with Joe Jelly, were credited with filling Frankie Schatz's head with lead, they got no respect from the man for whom they performed this deed. They expected the least Profaci could do was to give them a piece of the action in gambling or loan sharking or drug trafficking in Brooklyn's East New York section, which had been Abatamarco's territory. Instead, Profaci carved up the region among relatives and friends. That was the last straw for the Gallos and their co-conspirators. Joey Gallo, so tight-lipped on Capitol Hill, was far looser of tongue when he was heard speaking on a phone that had been bugged by the NYPD's Central Intelligence Bureau. Someone in the room was overheard saying to Joey, "Frank Costello has Louisiana. Who gave Louisiana to Frank Costello?" Gallo roared, "Eisenhower gave it to him?" Any man who is strong enough to take something and hold it, he owns it. If he is not strong enough to take it and hold it against all comers, nobody can give him Louisiana or any place else. Later, the CIB's Frank Salerno, considered one of America's foremost law enforcement experts on the Mafia, met Joey Gallo on a Brooklyn street and tried to pump him for information. Salerno knew by then that Profaci's troops were in revolt. He asked why. Although Joey was not specific with names, Salerno was certain that Gallo was bad-mouthing Don Joseph Profaci. Some old compare greaseball come over from Italy and moneybags put up 15 G's to open a grocery store for him. The delivery boy in the store stole the business right out from under his nose, and he goes bankrupt, and Moneybags backs him a second time. Throwing his hands up in disgust, Joey ranted on, "Me, I can't even get to run a crap game." "Why? You need a college education to run a crap game? When you want somebody hit, we're good enough. But not good enough to come to the house." The time was at hand for the uprising. It might have been a bloodless coup had it not been for the American system of justice. Joe Profaci and his underboss and brother-in-law, Joseph the Fat Man Magliocco, were among 20 of the Appalachian Conclave's delegates convicted in Manhattan Federal District Court for obstruction of justice because they refused to come clean on why the mobsters were in convention. But the convictions were reversed on appeal, thus dashing the hopes the Gallos and the other revolutionaries had of taking over after Uncle Sam had placed Profaci and Magliocco in a federal penitentiary. Adopting Joey Gallo's credo of "any man who is strong enough to take something and hold it, he owns it," the insurrectionists decided to take and hold. What they grabbed were the family's top leaders: Joe Profaci's brother-in-law Magliacco, Joe's brother, Frank Profaci, and two powerful aides and bodyguards, Salvatore Sali the Sheik Musacchia and John Simoni. The boss was also targeted for abduction, but he'd been alerted about the conspiracy. He hightailed it to a Florida hideout. Meanwhile, the hostages were held up in separate Manhattan hotel rooms under heavy guard for the following 2 weeks. Finally, a line of communication opened between the Gallos and Profaci. Don Joseph agreed to negotiate the Gallos' demands for a piece of the empire by placing them before the National Commission. Albert and Larry Gallo went for the proposal, but Joey and Joe Jelly turned thumbs down. Joey bellowed, "You kill one, you tell them you want 100 G's in cash as a good faith token. Then we sit down and talk." The dispute became so heated that Larry slapped Joey to silence him, then put him on a plane for California to spend some time cooling off. Meanwhile, the commission took up the dispute but couldn't reach a decision. Even if it found the complaints against Profaci's rule justified, it couldn't possibly render a verdict against him. For that would open a Pandora's box in the ranks of organized crime. Every dissident group in every family would demand a better deal, and the whole mafia structure would be in danger of collapsing. The counselors on the ruling mafia court declared that this was an internal family dispute that would have to be worked out by Profaci and the dissidents. The commission did make 2 rulings. 1, there should be a truce until a solution is reached. 2, other families must not get involved in the dispute. The truce begun in early 1961 was uneasy. Profaci made it so by undermining the Gallos and their young Turks. Don Joseph lured the younger defectors, 1 and 2 at a time, over a period of months until he had enough of them to make an offer they couldn't refuse. "Knock off the Gallos, and I'll make it worth your while. I'll give you a nice piece of the action." Even as the dissenters wooed back to Profaci's camp laid plans for ways and means to kill the Gallos, Joey eased the burden on their shoulders. He got himself arrested for extortion. On the night of May 1st, undercover cops sprang a trap on Joey Gallo. He'd been harassing the owner of several taverns and a check-cashing service to buy $40,000 worth of stolen liquor for a bargain $25,000. After weeks of negotiations and many middle-of-the-night threatening calls from Joey, the businessman agreed to meet him in one of his gin mills. The cops were seated nearby and heard Joey's answer when his victim asked for just a little more time to make up my mind. Joey Gallo cracked, "Sure, take 3 months in the hospital on me." The detective stood up from the adjoining booth, spread-eagled Joey against a wall, frisked him, and put the cuffs on him. No sooner was he booked on the extortion charge than he was out on bail. Later, a Kings County grand jury indicted him. But before he stood trial, a great deal transpired in the simmering Profaci-Gallo feud. It was destined to erupt into war, despite the commission's edict that both sides do their utmost to resolve their differences without a public airing. August 20th, 1960, was a day to remember in the Gallo-Profaci War. That Saturday, Joe Jelly Gioeli went deep-sea fishing, a passion of his. His car and Joe himself disappeared for what we must now consider was forever. Because all we know is the only evidence of Joe Jelly's outing on the Atlantic was his coat, wrapped around a dead fish, dumped from a car in front of a popular Brooklyn Gallo hangout. That same day, Profaci unlimbered a second volley against his revolutionaries. He sent his own bodyguard, John Simone, into a meeting with Larry Gallo. John implied to Larry that he was joining the Gallos in the insurrection against the boss. However, it was a play, but that was not the bottom line. The truth bore on the arrangement Profaci had worked up for Simone's meeting with Larry Gallo. John Simone had called the oldest Gallo brother earlier and asked him for a get-together. "Why don't you and we meet tonight in the Sahara Lounge?" John said. "Oh, sure, I'll be glad to meet you there," Larry Gallo responded. They agreed to be at the restaurant on Brooklyn's Utica Avenue at 5 p.m., an hour before the restaurant opened for dinner. Larry Gallo was already at the bar when Simone arrived with what he had promised would be an olive leaf. Larry had been offered rich rewards from Profaci even during the negotiations, but all he received from emissary John at this meeting was a $100 bill. "Hey! What kind of shit is this?" demanded Gallo when Simone crossed his palm with the century note. "This is no fucking good." Simone seemed nervous, or at least was acting out the part. "Hey, Paisan, please excuse me, I gotta go to the toilet." Before Profaci's emissary disappeared from view, Larry Gallo felt a horrendous tug around his neck. It was a thick rope that one of two men who suddenly loomed behind him had looped around his throat. One of the would-be garroters was Carmine the Snake Persico, whom Larry Gallo himself had trained to be an underworld hitman. But by now, Carmine had been won over to the boss's cause and was performing just what Profaci wanted him to do, make Larry hurt so badly that he would lure his two brothers into an assassination trap. Call them, Persico screamed at Larry. The rope was so tight around Gallo's neck, he couldn't utter a sound. All he could do was shake his head side to side in refusal. The rope was then pulled so taut that it caused Larry to defecate and urinate in his pants. By now, Larry had been dragged behind the bar for the coup de grace. But then his would-be assassins were interrupted, before they could administer the hit, by a police sergeant who walked in to have a chat with the bartender. Seeing the blue uniform and gold shield, Persico and his partner, joined by John Simone, dashed out a back door and headed to their car out front. The patrolman, who was the sergeant's driver, spotted the trio and tried to stop them. But he didn't. He was stopped instead with a shot to the face. Meanwhile in the bar, the sergeant found Larry Gallo barely alive. "Who did this to you?" the sergeant asked. "Never saw them," Gallo replied with a raspy voice. On that same day, two other young mafiosi, won over by Profaci's promises of a better deal, tried to do in Joey Gallo, but he eluded them. Hours later, a friend of Joey's, using his car, was shot at as he was driving near Idlewood Airport in Queens. Now the Gallos and their followers knew they were in for some deadly warfare. While screaming at Larry and Albert with admonitions that they should have listened to him and killed a Profaci soldier or two to make their point, Joey took refuge with them in two brick-faced tenements at 49 and 51 President Street, near the Brooklyn waterfront. They were in friendly territory. Their grandmother lived nearby, and their father, Albert Gallo Sr., volunteered to live with them and cook their meals. Altogether, there were some 30 Gallo men in residence there, all having vowed to wage a war of attrition against the boss's significantly larger force. Surrounded by mattresses as buffers against gunfire and for sleeping and a large store of food, the renegade mobsters prepared to stay holed up there and battle against Profaci's mob. Now and then they ventured out of their lair and engaged Profaci soldiers in mob warfare. But it was a lost cause. Profaci's men were knocking off the Gallo forces by a ratio of 3-1. In early December of 1961, after he'd been convicted and failed to appear for sentencing, police broke into the hideout and took Joey Gallo, then hauled him off to begin serving the 7 to 14-year prison sentence for extortion imposed by the court. Early in 1962, Joe Profaci suddenly took sick. His condition deteriorated week by week until on June 6th, he died. His successor was his brother-in-law, Joseph Magliocco, who proved immediately to be a weak, vacillating leader. The two remaining Gallo brothers on the Profaci family roster couldn't accept him, and the commission also refused to approve Magliocco as boss. The war continued, but more Gallo soldiers than Profaci loyalists dropped in the hail of gunfire that erupted sporadically over the Brooklyn landscape. Magliocco sought out Joseph Bonanno to intercede in his behalf and gain him the acceptance he needed from the syndicate to rule his late brother-in-law's family. Bonanno wanted a price, a share of the Profaci family's income. Magliocco agreed to the deal, but Bonanno couldn't swing it. The organization wanted no part of Magliocco as a family ruler. In the midst of this turmoil, Magliocco took sick and died before the end of 1963. Now suddenly the path was opened for a takeover of the family by a captain, a young ball of fire named Joseph Colombo, who had just passed his 40th birthday and had enough savvy to convince Larry and Albert Gallo that the mantle of leadership in the Profaci family should be handed to him. With a personal appeal to Carlo Gambino, Colombo made it. He promised that he'd never be a threat to the leadership of New York's other mafia families. Nor would he even try to occupy Profaci's place on the National Commission, thus making it possible for a deserving mafia leader from another part of the country to be seated and help broaden the Commission's geographic influences in the nation. Colombo didn't reach the pinnacle of acceptance just like that. He had been involved earlier in a plot that had been hatched by Joe Bonanno after Profaci's death. Joe Bonanno suddenly seemed to envision himself as the boss of all bosses and wasted little time laying the groundwork to achieve that goal. He decided he was going to eliminate all the bosses who stood in his way: Lucchese, Gambino, Buffalo's Stefano Magaddino, and even Los Angeles leader Frank Di Simone. He approached Magliocco, then only less than a year from death, and swayed him into his fold with promises of rich rewards after the takeover. Magliocco was so enthused that he agreed to handle the contracts for the New York murders, Lucchese and Gambino. He then summoned Joe Colombo and ordered him to take care of the assignment. But Colombo looked upon Magliocco as a loser and promptly went to Gambino with a complete rundown on the plans worked up by the man who'd taken over Joe Profaci's leadership. Gambino called an emergency session of the commission, which included Lucchese, Philadelphia boss Angelo Bruno, and Chicago's Momo Giancana, among others. Gambino's tidings greatly upset the commission heads because they stirred unhappy memories of the violent internecine warfare of the 1920s and early 1930s, as well as the bloody episodes inspired by Vito Genovese in recent times, when he had Frank Costello shot and Albert Anastasia assassinated. The overlords summoned Magliocco to face the commission. Trembling and in tears, the man who would be king suddenly was pleading for his life. The leaders sensed that Magliocco lacked the internal fortitude to have conceived of the plot to murder the leaders, most likely hatched by ambitious Bonanno, and they spared Joe's life. They fined him $50,000, stripped him of the leadership he had taken over from his brother-in-law, and let him go home to die within a few months of a heart attack. Joe Colombo was then richly rewarded. He was anointed as boss of the Profaci family, and at the same time acknowledged as the youngest mob leader and syndicate member in the country. Now the National Council turned its attentions to Joseph Bonanno. He had to be dealt with for planning the hits against his fellow mafiosi. However, Bonanno, who had wide and varied interests that ranged from legitimate garment manufacturing to a nationwide narcotics operation, was nowhere to be found. He abandoned his outposts in Brooklyn and Long Island, the Midwest, Arizona, Canada, and the Caribbean, and went into hiding in California. Bonanno ignored 2 successive summonses to appear for trial before the commission. This infuriated the bosses. Joseph Colombo, who took over the leadership of the Profaci family in 1963, commanded very little respect as a boss, even though the commission had given him their blessings. Mobsters from the other families couldn't understand how the commission had picked Colombo to head the family that Joe Profaci had almost run into the ground. What was needed to strengthen the crime family Colombo now headed was a tough, arrogant, no-nonsense leader. But at the time, there were only 2 others in the Profaci crime family's ranks considered to be viable candidates: Salvatore Mineo and Joseph Iacovelli. Yet neither was strong enough for the role. For that matter, neither was Joe Colombo. Joe wanted the power Carlo Gambino had. Carlo's family was thriving under his reign. Colombo's wasn't. It was weak at the top, and morale among the soldiers was at its lowest level ever, especially since they had waged the bloody, costly war with the Gallos. In Colombo, Gambino had a man who was a veritable slave to him, and in effect that gave Carlo control of 2 families. New Jersey's boss, Sam the Plumber de Cavalcante, was recorded on FBI wiretaps in a conversation with his underboss Frank Maggiore. "I told you," Sam opened the dialogue. "I was surprised when I heard he was in there. I never would have made that guess." What experience had he got? Sam wanted to know. He was a small-time hood all his life. A time eventually came when even Carlo Gambino became distressed with Joseph Colombo. It wasn't the way he was running his crime family, but how he was all at once coming to the defense of the Mafia, as no member of the underworld society had ever done before. This was now the advent of the 1970s, and the growing public consciousness of the secret Italian society was due not only to the Kefauver hearings, but also the McClellan disclosures. By now, with Carlo Gambino's strong support, Joe Colombo had revivified his family and was sitting on top of the heap. His mob had a firm control of gambling in Brooklyn and Queens. They were plundering Kennedy International Airport of stolen cargo. They were shafting New York State by smuggling tax-free cigarettes from the South, and were obtaining riches from numerous other rackets. Joe himself was living in the lap of luxury that even the extravagant Al Capone never dreamed could have existed. He owned a fashionable home in Brooklyn, a country estate with his own private horse track, swimming pool, and all the other trappings of the wealthiest legitimate American barons of big business. But there was one rub, and it grated on Colombo's thin Italian hide. "They ain't giving me no respect," was the complaint of this mob boss, who was now reading and seeing too many Mafia books and movies, and becoming so obsessed by the low esteem Italians were held in, that he decided to try and change that concept. Of the amazement and chagrin of the Commission, and all others in organized crime, Joe Colombo founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League to counter the bad image that was being imposed on Italian Americans in general. But this was a ploy that Colombo worked up to take law enforcement agencies off the mob's back. He organized the League just after the FBI arrested his son, Joseph Jr., on a charge that he had melted down dimes, quarters, and half-dollars, and made them into ingots that were far more valuable for the silver than the face value of the coins in monetary use. His reasoning in establishing the League was not only to lay upon the grievances of all respectable Italian Americans who resented the Mafia label, but to use the organization as a coercive force against the federal government from harassing the mob. As it turned out, his own son's arrest was a case of the Justice Department moving too precipitately in a case where evidence was, at most, threadbare. The government's chief witness cracked on the stand and admitted he had lied when he named young Colombo in the plot. The charges against Little Joe were then dropped. Colombo thought that if he could focus on the public's growing sensitivities to ethnic bias, he could meld a relationship in people's minds between anti-Italian feelings and the increasing crackdowns on the Mafia-run organized crime gangs. The bottom line: sell the public the idea that law enforcement is discriminatory and make them believe that it's all a civil rights issue. It'll give the mob some breathing room to operate. What he had done in 1970 was not a new concept. Twice before, Italian Americans had organized themselves into fraternities to foster a better image of themselves and thwart further embarrassing reflections of themselves as mafiosi. During the 1960s, the Federation of Italian American Democratic Organizations was founded by New York City Congressman Alfred Santangelo. The immediate purpose was to get TV's popular show The Untouchables off the air, because what Elliot Ness was doing to savage the Chicago mob was giving Italian Americans a weekly black eye in prime time. The organization is said to have covertly initiated by the mob, but it stayed behind the scenes and never let their hand show. The producers and network refused demands by the Fado to take the show off the air. So an Italian-American boycott was organized against the program's sponsor, Chesterfield Cigarettes. In less than a year, Liggett & Myers caved in and withdrew its commercials. The show's demise followed soon, as did a fade-out of the Federation of Italian-American Democratic Organization. By 1970, it seemed that the Italian-American Civil Rights League was going somewhere. By rushing off to a courthouse wherever and whenever a member or members of organized crime were busted, by rallying with sandwich signs, bleeding protests, and generally causing commotion after every arrest, Joe Colombo won a large following. He became a folk hero of sorts. The late night as well as morning talk shows rolled out the red carpet for Joe to show before the cameras and cry about the terrible way Italian Americans were being treated by the law. On June 28, 1970, Colombo held his first Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle, on the southwestern fringe of Central Park. Thousands showed up, and the Italian-American Civil Rights League seemed to be on its way as a force in influencing sympathy and sentiment for his cause. One of Colombo's most notable achievements was in having the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra dropped from the Godfather script. While he had won the affections of many Italian Americans who had had their fill of the unflattering Italian American attitudes and were pleased with the progress the Mafia boss had made in gaining respect for them, there was no comparable admiration for Joe Colombo in the Mafia hierarchy. To the mob, he was an unwanted press agent straight out of the pages of What Makes Sammy Run. He was dubbed the Mafia's Sammy Glick. The feverish activity that Joe Colombo engaged in to draw attention to the Mafia worked well for him, but he was losing further favor elsewhere. For all the gains he had made in garnering respect for Italian Americans, he accomplished the one thing the crime syndicate had not wanted to happen: the focus of public attention and awareness on the Mafia. Colombo was making the other family bosses look like second-class citizens by the way he was commanding media attention. All of America was looking upon Joseph Colombo as the underworld boss above all other Mafia leaders who was going to end Italian-American discrimination. He was also the heroic figure of the groundbreaking 1970 Italian-American Unity Day, which was being prepared for a repeat performance. The date for the second annual Italian Unity Day was scheduled for June 28, 1971. But this one was not being received with the same enthusiasm as the first rally. Carlo Gambino took the lead in seeing to it that the second affair did not have the rousing success the first one did. He sent out word that soldiers were to stay away from the demonstration. Moreover, Brooklyn longshoremen couldn't take off the day with pay, as they had done the year before, to attend. Then came the tip-off that Joe Colombo should have realized meant the end of the line for him. His league's chief organizer, Joseph DeCicco, suddenly tossed in his resignation. He used ill health as an excuse. Another underworld bigwheel, Tony Scotto, son-in-law of the late Albert Anastasia and nephew by marriage to Brooklyn dock boss Anthony Anastasio, sent word he wouldn't attend the second gathering as he had the first. During this time that the bosses were withdrawing support from Colombo's league, one of his most dangerous enemies, Joseph Gallo, was released from prison. Imprisoned when Colombo had arranged an end to the Gallo-Profaci war and taken over Joe's family, Crazy Joe was still seething. For he had not been consulted about the peace terms when Colombo reached accord with his rivals in the Gallo mob for peace. Crazy Joe Gallo wasn't willing to agree to the terms of the 1963 treaty, not only because it had been signed without him, but because of the disarray in which his once strong organization was now wallowing. With older brother Larry having died of cancer in 1968, and younger brother Albert not demonstrating his brother's qualities as a mob leader, Joe was furious about the current state of affairs his gang was in. Its status was hardly equal to the 5 established crime families that were organized in the early 1930s and were still thriving. Whether Carlo Gambino, now without question the ruling mafioso of the country, and the commission which he headed, decided to act against Colombo isn't known. Yet the rate at which the big wheels from the 1970 rally were washing their hands of the 1971 affair clearly indicated orders were coming from somewhere on high to cool it. This much was certain. With Joey Gallo back on the street, tensions between the Colombo and Gallo forces mounted quickly. Despite the withdrawal of an increasing number of top-ranking underworld figures, Colombo tried to make the best of a deteriorating situation by using the only tools at his disposal to get his way: threats and muscle. His soldiers invaded Italian neighborhoods, ordered shopkeepers to close for the day and to post signs announcing the time and place of the rally. Just as soon as Colombo's emissaries departed, Gallo gangsters and those from other families entered the shops and warned merchants not to attend the rally and to take the posters down. Several of Colombo's advance men returned to the boss with news that they were roughed up by Crazy Joe's torpedoes and tossed out of the neighborhoods they were canvassing. But Joe Colombo could not be dissuaded from staging the demonstration. June 28, 1971, a Monday, dawned oppressively hot. It didn't deter the tens of thousands of Italian Americans and other ethnic groups from showing up at Columbus Circle. True, the crowd was somewhat smaller than the previous year, but it still had an enthusiastic and festive air about it. The same could be said about Joe Colombo and his bodyguards as they arrived in a chauffeur-driven limousine that discharged them in the middle of the crowd. It seemed everyone rushed the crime boss to shake his hand and shower him with praise for his efforts in behalf of Italian Americans. Joe looked like a politician on the campaign trail as he squeezed his clenched fists high over his head and saluted the crowd's welcoming cheers. Colombo looked as though he had hardly a care in the world. If the snubs and backbiting of the leaders and subordinates from the other families had gotten to him, he surely didn't betray any sign of it. Nor did he seem concerned about his safety, for he moved through the throngs in a jubilant mood, his face frozen in a perpetual smile. In an instant, Joe Colombo's face was transformed into a blood-spattered mask of horror by 3 rapidly fired shots from a 7.65 caliber gun in the hand of a black man who, until a second or two before, had a camera in one hand and was pretending to be a newspaper photographer. As Colombo crumpled to the pavement, the explosion of bullets brought undercover police detectives on the run from their places in the mass of humanity. But by the time they reached the shooting scene, they had at their feet 2 unmoving bodies lying in 2 separate pools of blood. The assassin never had a chance to have his day in court. He was meted instant Mafia justice by Colombo's bodyguards, who filled his body with so much lead that several policemen who jumped on the killer to keep him pinned wasted their energy. He was killed instantly. Meanwhile, Colombo was lifted into a gurney, wheeled into an ambulance, and sped to Roosevelt Hospital. He was barely alive. He'd been struck in the head and neck at point-blank range, and it took several hours of surgery to remove the slugs. This was the beginning of several months of hospitalization for Boss Joe Colombo, but when he was finally discharged and sent home for what was loosely termed convalescence, everyone knew that Joe would never make it back to lead his crime family. The damage to his brain was so extensive that he was reduced to a vegetative state. He would remain in that state for several years until his death. Meanwhile, no official motive could be associated with the would-be killer's attack on Colombo. The name Jerome A. Johnson meant nothing to authorities, although they and many of Colombo's followers fixed it firmly in their minds that the attempted execution was masterminded by Crazy Joe Gallo. Giving some credence to that belief was an awareness that while doing his stretch, Gallo had befriended a number of blacks in the big house and even organized a civil rights unit for them. Thus, it was entirely possible Joey had cultivated friends who were able to enlist the services of a gunman in the black community who couldn't be connected to him for the hit on Colombo. Of course, the New York Police Department tossed Joe on the grill, and of course, he insisted that, "I don't know who would want to do such a terrible thing to such a nice guy like my good friend Joe." So far as the keenest watchers of mob activity viewed the situation, it wouldn't matter whether or not Joe Gallo had ordered the shooting. He was bound to be fingered as the architect of Colombo's demise as a mob boss, because it was to Gallo's advantage to have that other Joe out of the way. Crazy Joe knew this full well and made himself as scarce as he could on the street. He hid out in a flat on Manhattan's West 14th Street with his wife, expecting bloody warfare to break out between his renegade band of mafiosi and the Colombo family. Except for some close but insignificant brushes, the expected Colombo-Gallo War never materialized. At least not during the rest of 1971 and into the beginning of 1972. By mid-January 1972, after more than 6 months in virtual hibernation, Joe Gallo was fed up with the hermit's dreary life and emerged from his self-imposed exile. He did a complete turnabout. He returned to many of his old saloon hangouts and branched out to other classier places he'd never been to before, such as Sardi's, the Recnode Times Square restaurant that was a magnet for the showbiz crowd for many years, and Elaine's, newly heralded as the in-place for the literary cognoscenti. He also attended Broadway openings, played bridge and chess, discussed literature and the classics, and gathered about him a circle of the most unlikely friends with no connections whatsoever to the underworld. Among them, playwright, producer, director Neil Simon, actress Joan Hackett, and actor Jerry Orbach and his wife Marta, who was to recall at a later time that Joey was always talking about going straight. Meanwhile, law enforcement officials adamantly insisted that Crazy Joe Gallo was as deeply entrenched in the front lines of racketeering as ever. But Carlo Gambino also could have said as much, for the crazy man had aroused anger in the boss of bosses as no one ever before. Gambino could forgive Joe Colombo's stupidity for starting the well-intentioned Italian-American Civil Rights League. After all, Colombo was still Carlo's very obedient servant, his lackey, and never would Joe have ever dared do the deeds Gallo and his gang were doing now. In mid-March 1972, Gallo was summoned for an audience with the boss of bosses. "I want you, wise guy, to cut the shit out," Carlo Gambino pointing at Joey. "For too long now I let you run rogue, but you're not going to get away with it any longer." "What the fuck are you complaining about, Grandpa?" Gallo interrupted angrily. "Tell me, what the fuck's bugging you?" Gambino took a long, deep breath and screwed his face into a scowl. "I'ma tell you to stop muscling in on my operations in East Harlem. I want you to keep your dirty hands off the business I got in the area, and I don't want you messing up other things I got going in my territory," Gambino replied. They didn't call him Crazy Joe Gallo for no reason. This was the moment he earned his name in spades. Leaping to his feet with a loud, ear-piercing Indian war cry meant to be a derisive put-down of the big man, Joey bent at the waist and leaned his torso forward until his face was almost touching Gambino's face, now masked by utter astonishment. "Do you know what I have to say to you, old fart?" Gallo thundered, his saliva showering Carlo's stunned facial expression. "I tell you to go fuck yourself." Then Crazy Joe allegedly spat in Carlo Gambino's face. As Time magazine commented on the incident, if that act seemed foolhardy, it was nevertheless typical of Gallo, who never had the sense to play by the rigid rules of the Mafia. Crazy Joe Gallo could now be counted among the walking dead. But you'd never believe his days were numbered, from the way he hopscotched around town, dropping in on Jerry and Marta Orbach in their Greenwich Village place to chat about the autobiography the actor was going to write for Joey, and being seen on the streets and nightclubs with a youngish woman who certainly wasn't his wife. Shortly after he came out of his 14th Street hibernation, Joe divorced his wife. And as he approached his 43rd birthday, he began to keep company with pretty, affable Sina Essery, a divorcee who toiled days as a dental assistant and spent nights out with the gangsters in Crazy Joe's company. On or about March 12th, Gallo made 2 more significant turns on his peripatetic trek as a mobster and social climber. He had not only invaded Carlo Gambino's Harlem haunts for a cut of the booty, but also was taking dead aim at a number of the rackets that had been controlled by Carmine the Snake Persico. Carmine was no longer running his businesses because he had been sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta to do 14 years for hijacking. Then Joey married Sina Essery and adopted her 10-year-old daughter as his own. By now, Gallo had made himself prey for an open season on himself. Yet no one was quite able to lure Joey into a trap or an ambush. The evening of April 7th was like most others of the past 3 months, following Joey's emergence from hiding. It started out for Joey, Sina, his sister Carmela, and his bodyguard Pete, the Greek Dipiolis, with drinks, dinner, and the early show at the Copacabana. This was a special occasion, Joey's 43rd birthday. After a round of other night spots that lasted until nearly 3 a.m., Joey and his party made their way downtown in a limo piloted by DiPiolis to Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street in the heart of Little Italy. The pre-dawn breakfast they had come to eat was hardly down their gullets when, at precisely 4 a.m., 4 men with drawn pistols entered through a side door and made their way toward Gallo's table. He did not see them, for his back was toward the door. But Sina and Carmela, seated on the opposite side, caught sight of the intruders, and their eyes opened wide in horror. Seeing their reaction, Joe wheeled around and glared at them. For an instant, all 4 men stopped in their tracks. But then one moved toward Gallo. "You son of a bitch!" he screamed as all 4 gunmen, as well as Joey's bodyguard, began firing. Some 24 shots were fired in little more than a minute. In the end, only Joey took gunshots. He was hit by 2 bullets in the restaurant and 1 more, the coup de grace, after he staggered out and collapsed on the sidewalk. The gunman escaped in a waiting getaway car. Seconds later, a police cruiser came to a screeching stop in front of Umberto's. The patrolmen were attracted there by Carmela's hysterical cries. Gallo was beyond aid when he was brought into the emergency room of Beekman Downtown Hospital. At his funeral 3 days later, Sister Carmela stood in front of the casket and cried to her unhearing brother, "The streets are going to run red with blood, Joey." And they did. Later that day, a Colombo captain, Gennaro Ciprio, was slain gangland style. Over the next few days, 4 more underworld figures were blown away. The killings continued uninterruptedly for several weeks, until the toll reached a dozen dead mobsters. By now, the Gallo gang was quaking in their boots. Albert Gallo, my do-nothing brother, as Crazy Joe called him, had taken command of the men in his mob and barricaded them in apartments on President Street, almost directly opposite the flats in which they'd taken refuge during the 3 years of the Gallo-Profaci War of the 1960s. From his President Street lair, Albert Gallo asserted himself as the leader his brother didn't think he would ever be. He issued contracts for hits on 3 top captains, Alphonse "Alley Boy" Persico, the imprisoned Snake's brother, and Joe Iacovelli, both with the Colombo family, and Nick Bianco, a mafioso from the New England regime of Raymond Partiarca, who was in the forefront of negotiating the pact that ended the Gallo-Profaci War a decade before. However, the new war between the Colombo and Gallo factions couldn't be settled at a conference table, because Carlo Gambino didn't want peace to come until the 2 sides had decimated and destroyed each other. In fact, the Gambino family was supplying guns and ammunition to the warring families. The rationale was simple. The more of each other they kill, the fewer Carlo would have to contend with when he moved in to take control over the families. Gambino stepped closer to that goal less than 3 months after the Gallo hit is when Thomas Eboli, one of the trio of underbosses who inherited the Genovese crime family in 1969, was gunned down on a Brooklyn street. That left Gerardo Catina and Michelle Miranda as surviving leaders of the clan. But with Catina arrested, tried, convicted, and now imprisoned for racketeering, and Michelle Miranda at 78 too old to do anything about it, Gambino had yet a 3rd mafia family under his thumb. There were 2 more to go. Thus began the killing of other mafiosi to scare those remaining tribes, the Lucchese and Bonanno families, to come under Gambino's rule. The Lucchese family got the message first and fell in line immediately after leader Carmine Tramunti came to the conclusion that he wanted no further alliance with Gambino. Not very long after, the head of the Bonanno family, Natale Evole, along with Philip Rastelli and Joseph Di Filippo, also let Carlo Gambino know they were perfectly willing to play fair and square in his ballpark. By now, Carlo Gambino had become so powerful that none of the other families across the length and breadth of the United States could challenge him. And thus he became the Mafia's new capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, the first since Salvatore Maranzano, who was assassinated in 1931. A new era in the American Mafia and organized crime had begun.